Welcome, everybody. It's good to have you back here for this session. This is our 8th session, if I'm still counting correctly. This is our 8th session of the class on the history of Zionism. Wonderful to have all of you joining us tonight. And wonderful to have all of you joining us whenever you're going to be watching this. It's good to be together, and it's good to keep on learning about this history of Zionism that continues to be extremely relevant on this year 2024 as we see history unfolding in front of our eyes almost every day. For those of you who are on the Zoom call, as usual, please send me your questions in the Zoom room. I will do my best to answer them at the end of the class. Otherwise, please remain muted. And we are going to start, as always, with our Shalom chant. So close your eyes and find your breath. And just take this moment to relax and let go of the day that was, so we can be fully present to this moment, fully present to receive whatever is going to be made available through this time together. And as always, as we come together, we open with energies of wholeness and peace and harmony for ourselves in our lives, for our community, for the world. We start with a chant for peace. And then we continue with a blessing for presence. So if you want to chant with me, take a breath now for Shalom. Shalom. יהיו לרצון עם רפי והגיון ליבי לפניך, אדוני. Holy One of Being, Holy One who is reflected through each and every one of us, through all of creation, as all of creation, help us to know your presence as our breath, as the beating of our heart, that the words of our mouth and the meditations of our heart might flow from the fullness of your being, the compassion at the center of your presence. Adonai Tzuri v'Go'ali, help us to remember that you are that which manifests as this shape of us. And you are that which liberates us from our identification with it. Amen. So, as always, when we begin, I say that we have a lot to cover tonight, but I think it's exceptionally true tonight. And I also want to start with saying that this session will be by far the most challenging session to date. What I'm covering today is going to be very hard, and I want to give it all the time it needs. And because there are a lot of different unfolding pieces to the story I'm about to tell, I have decided, maybe to help each of us, put things in different boxes. I've decided to break it down into different parts, maybe to help with clarity. So instead of telling one long story, unpacking one long parts of our history, I'm going to break it down in looking from different places at the same few years that we're looking at. So I hope it will help clarity for all of us. So fasten your seatbelts. Here we go. Part 1. Part 1 of our story tonight has to do with the aftermath of the riots of 1929, which we covered last session. The aftermath of the 1929 riots. So, what happened? Do you remember, I hope you do, what I said Britain wanted to accomplish in the Middle East as World War I was starting? If you remember, it wanted to protect the Suez Canal, and it wanted to achieve that by creating a buffer zone that the British saw could be achieved by conquering Palestine. And it wanted to protect, by protecting the Suez Canal, the routes to its far East Empire, the traffic route through the canal to India. Right? So that's the buffer it wanted. And then it wanted also to open a trans-Middle Eastern roadway between the Mediterranean Sea and the Persian Gulf. Both were very strategic goals, aiming at improving, again, its connection with India, which was the crown jewel of the empire. Now, as we enter the 1930s, one can look back and say that basically it has achieved both of these goals, having established its dominance over most of the Middle East, splitting north and south with France, and taking over the entire scope, the entire breadth of the territory exactly between the Mediterranean Sea and the Gulf and the Persian Gulf. So on the ground, strategically, that these goals were achieved and then some. In the process, it somehow, circuitally, I guess, in kind of a back-around kind of a way, justified or completed its promise, whether it was official and unofficial, to Sharif, the Sharif Hussein of Mecca, through basically ordaining, I would say, two of his sons, Faisal and Abdullah, to be respectively king of Iraq and king of Transjordan, and in the process having split Palestine itself into two different areas. One that became Transjordan under the rule of King Abdullah, and the other that it kept under the mandate that it was given by the League of Nations. So one could say really that Sharif Hussein's original vision of this pan-Arab independence had been realized, though not as the one unified state that he dreamed of ruling over, but as several separate Arab states, two of which were ruled by his own sons. The part of Palestine that Britain kept under its full mandated control was the west part of the Jordan River, the territory in the west of the Jordan River. Okay? Scholars say that it was probably vaguely promised as well to Sharif Hussein, but it was also vaguely promised to the Jews that, could have eventually maybe have some of it, all of it, part of it, that could become a Jewish national home for its scattered, persecuted people. But because all of these vague promises were made, some were actually official declaration, like the Balfour Declaration, the Jews believed the British, and as persecuted people in Europe, they started to make their way home. So from a Jewish population of about 50,000 at the end of the First World War, the third Aliyah, as we discovered, brought another 37,000, and then the fourth Aliyah brought another 80,000. So by the time the 1929 riots that I mentioned last session explode, there are at that time about 170,000 Jews in Palestine. 170,000 Jews in Palestine. Now, more than the riots themselves, it is what happens after them that comes to threaten the very future, the very hopes of the Jewish national home. After the riots, the British send 3 different teams at the end of 1929 and 1930 to study and report on what happened during these riots, to draw conclusions in an official paper, and to make suggestions for the future of the mandate. The commission that is one of the commission that is sent is called the Shaw Commission, and their report is issued on March 31st, 1930. And then there is another commission that is sent called the Hope-Simpson Commission, and they issue a report together with a white paper that is known as the Passfield White Paper, and both the Hope-Simpson report and the Passfield White Paper are issued on the same day, in October 20th, 1930. So about 6 months later. The two reports and the white paper determine that, yes, the Arabs were wholly and fully responsible for the entire unraveling of the violence of the 1929 revolts and riots. And yes, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the British appointed Mufti of Jerusalem, was the one who incited, was the one who led the revolt himself. But, they argued, that all of these riots and these insurrections, they were not really premeditated. And that really ultimately the Arabs had no choice but to revolt because, and I quote, they revolted because of their feelings of animosity and hostility toward the Jews. They revolted because of their disappointment of their political and national aspirations and fear for their economic future. And all the reports, despite putting squarely the blame on the riots on the Mufti of Jerusalem and the Arabs, all the reports concluded and proposed that Jewish immigration and Jewish land purchases should be slowed almost to a halt. The Yishuv, which is the Hebrew for the Jewish community in the land, the Yishuv was as angry at the reports as it was in shock. Weizmann went to London to remind the powers that be, to remind London and the British government that the mandate's responsibility was not about the 170,000 Jews that existed in Palestine. He had to remind them that the mandate was for the entire Jewish people residing outside of the country. And once again, like in 1921, as you remember, just 8 years earlier, the British rewarded Arab violence by acceding to all their demands. For the Mufti of Jerusalem, it was clear that their strategy of violence was working. All three reports appear to completely repudiate the Balfour Declaration itself. But to the Yishuv, it was the real anti-Zionist tone of the reports that was most alarming. It felt to the Jews in the land like a betrayal of the solemn trust between the Jews and Britain. It felt like the British were rescinding the promise made to them. They were withdrawing the promise made to them. You know, again, this notion of the over-promised land. This over-promised land, it seemed to the Jews of Palestine, and maybe to the Muslims as well, that this over-promised land came with an invisible, self-destruct mechanism. It's like in the movie, this message will self-destruct at the end of it. It's kind of the same idea. But Britain, just as it had reached out to Sharif Hussein of Mecca in the opening days of World War I, in order to protect its ships and its routes from being attacked as they sailed through the Red Sea en route for India, Britain did not want the Arab population in Palestine, and therefore beyond Palestine, to burst aflame in anger, therefore disrupting this new oil pipeline they were building, attacking British ships, attacking British planes, and even attacking land transport. So the British, feeling that they had solved the problem of what they wanted to accomplish with the First World War, by having solved that problem, created the same problem for themselves, having conquered the land they thought would resolve the problem in the first place. Because first and foremost, the British Crown, the British government, the British Empire needed to protect its forces and its interests. And in these matters of empire matters, the Jews were of absolute no use to them. They didn't weigh anything on the balance of their strategic planning and their strategic needs. For them, when British national and imperial interests were at stake, their choices were very clear. They could not afford to risk offending the Arabs now that they had given them power over Transjordan and over Iraq, the very places where all these pipelines, all these planes, all these routes, and all these ships around were traveling. With that in mind, Weizmann nonetheless went to London and through incredible diplomatic efforts managed to relentlessly pressure the British government and ultimately succeeded in the sense that, though damning as they were, the recommendations that the three reports had made were never implemented. So think about this. Both sides think that they have won. The Mufti of Jerusalem and his followers think that violence is what yields to results. But the Jews and Weizmann believe that diplomacy can still prevail and that they can actually reduce the sentence by pressuring the British government. So at the end and the aftermath of the 1929 riots, this is what each side takes away from the results. Now, the Arab population, since I talked about the Jewish population, the Arab population has nearly doubled by the mid-1930s, and really like in just 20 years. And it has now come to about 1 million people. So 170,000 Jews, 1 million Arab populations. How has the Arab population doubled in 20 years? Well, thanks in part to a booming Arab economy, mostly fostered by Jewish growth and investments. Many Arab landowners become wealthy overnight when they sell their land to Jews, but also the Jews come and expand markets for agricultural produce. They expand markets in their need in building material and construction projects. They bring with them higher wages. There are new services that are needed for the growing population. And between the Jewish investments in the infrastructure and the economic development of the land and the British investment in construction projects, in in the construction of roads, and as we talked about, telegraph, and all the infrastructures of a developing nation, all of those became a bonanza, really, to the Arab economy. And you can add to that a rise in literacy, the creation of a new middle class, and white-collar jobs, also really growing leaps and bounds in the Arab economy, which is also the seed, as we will see, or actually creates the soil, the fertile soil for the rise of Arab nationalism. And the Mufti certainly begins to capitalize on the changes in Arab society. Before I get to that, another reason for the growth in population on the Arab side is that, and I think I mentioned that last time as well, a lot of the Arabs who live in other states on the periphery of the British mandated Palestine are very attracted to the economy that is booming there. And so there is also migration, Arab migration, Muslim migration into the land as well, that obviously add to the growth in population in Palestine itself. So back to the Mufti. The Mufti is very keen into understanding the changes of Arab society. He sees the growth of the middle class. He sees people being more readily educated, and he sees the potential for new ways of thinking, nationalistic vision to be seeded in the Arab-Palestinian world. And so he begins teaching his followers, and that's very important. He begins to teach his followers to see the British mandate as a tyranny led by colonialist infidels, right? Colonialist infidels propping Jewish non-believers against the Muslims. Right? So I really want you to really capture this understanding of the Mufti that is going to translate into him telling that story to the Arab of Palestine. And again, that story that the British mandate is tyranny, right? It's colonialist infidels ruling over and propping Jewish non-believers against the Muslims. And that's all. There's all these components here that are very, very important to remember, because they're the seed, they're the key to understanding how Palestinians to this day understand themselves and understand the conflict with the Jews in Israel, Palestine. They see the Jews as being an invading force propped by the great British Empire, who itself is a colonialist enterprise, an imperialist colonialist enterprise. So there is this association, right? The propaganda, that the story that the Mufti is crafting is very interesting. It's completely wrong. It's completely false. But he's trying to lump together the Jews and the British. And there are psychological reasons for that I'm going to get to at a later stage. But it's really important for you, for us, for all of us, to understand the birth of this narrative. And we had a sense of it earlier, because I mentioned that there was also this sense that those Jews who came in the 1880s and in the early 1900s, who came from Russia, right? Remember, I mentioned that because I mentioned that at the time the Ottoman Empire was at war with Russia, and these Jews were coming from Russia into Arab lands, into the Ottoman Empire, right? And so there's already this sense that, oh, these Jews that are coming back, they are propped up by the Russian Tsar, by the Russian Empire, by the Russian colonialist forces, right? So now it's no longer the Russian colonialist forces that are propping up those Jews. Now the Mufti is taking that story and is reshaping it into, now not the Russians, now it's actually, those Jews didn't come, it's the British that are propping them. These colonialist British infidels are bringing with them, almost like, bringing them and then dropping them on our doorstep, to colonize our land, right? So he makes that as a direct association between the British and the Jews, who are refugees from persecution, but he ignores that because he's trying to foster hatred to prop his own power, right? And so he's making this false alignment. But that is a story that is never going to leave how Palestinians, Arab Palestinians, understand history. So it's very critical for all of us to really understand this. And it happens, again, the seed was, with the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire. That story began back then and there. And we'll need to understand more deeply why that is the case. There is a deep psychological context to that. But for now, we just remain with the beginning of that story that is now retold in the context of colonialist British Empire, and how the Jews who come here are basically the props of that colonialist, or those colonialist forces. So that's the story that the Mufti begins to repeat over and over again, that is disseminated through his groups, through his followers, and at the same time, he begins to organize paramilitary groups. And even, I talked about that other Palestinian family, right, that was opposing the Husseini family of the Mufti. If you remember, their name was Nashashibi. So even the Nashashibi family, who still is opposing the Husseini family, is now limited because of the very successful propaganda of the Mufti, is very limited to vie for power against the Mufti and the Husseini family by, in fact, doubling down on anti-Balfour and anti-mandate rhetoric. Right? They're trying to outflank the Mufti on its extremist side. They're trying to be more extremist than him in order to take back the Arab street, if you'd like. But by the mid 1930s, it seemed that the Arab radicalization, this fierce radicalization, nationalistic radicalization that is fueled by Hajj Amin, by the Mufti, is so deeply seated that it seems that it would forever prevent any possible accommodation with the Jews. And that's the danger of what the Mufti started, is that he pushed, especially the leadership of the Palestinian people, so quickly and so far to the extreme in the nationalism that he was building, that it's almost like the nationalistic idea itself was predicated on the impossibility of integrating or negotiating or accommodating the Jews in the land. On the Jewish side, the moderates within the great Zionist coalition, the moderates were also starting to lose ground, not only following the riots, that was hard for them to digest, but also and mostly because of the British response. And you will see that, you will read that Ben-Gurion and the Labor Zionist Party, how they respond, and you will learn about Jabotinsky, who is, so if the Labor is on the left, Jabotinsky is on the right, and his revisionist party, and their radical ideals in the book, in the excerpts from Sachar that you will receive tomorrow. All right, so that was part one, the aftermath of the riots, what happened. Part two, our next topic for tonight, the fifth Aliyah. Part two, the fifth Aliyah. So the fifth Aliyah is the last pre-state Aliyah, meaning the wave of immigration to Palestine, the fifth and last wave of immigration prior to the State of Israel. And that takes place between 1932, mostly 1932 and 1935. Despite the violence of 1929, and one would say, despite the violence, the early 1930s in Jewish Palestine are years of great prosperity as well. I mentioned that it's the case in the Arab part of the equation, but obviously it is also true for the Jewish community, which, think about it. This is the early 1930s. It's really in sharp contrast to whatever else is going on, especially in the Western world, where after the crash of the fall of September 1929 on Wall Street, the rest of the world, many economies have literally collapsed, right? We have the Great Depression here in America, and in Europe. Europe is an absolute disaster economically. Germany's economy, already crippled by the Versailles Treaty, is in shambles. Really, the inflation there skyrocketing, and the economy is completely falling apart. But in contrast, Palestine is booming. And just as for the Arab side, on the Jewish side, one of the main factors of the booming of that economy is also the massive arrival of new immigrants. And this fifth Aliyah more than doubles the Jewish population of Palestine in just 3 years. By 1935, we find about 375,000 Jews in the land. So 1 million Arab Palestinians and 375,000 Jewish Palestinians at the time. So about a third of the population is Jewish. A little less than that. Who are these Jews who arrive and contribute to the doubling of the population? Well, the majority are, once again, escaping the persecutions, the anti-Semitic persecutions that are still unraveling in Poland and also in Romania. Romania. There I go. Romania. And for the first time, there is a minority, but a significant minority of Jews who begin to immigrate, not from Eastern Europe, although Polish people would say that, argue that they don't want Poland to be classified as Eastern European, but that's always debatable. But Central European Jews are also immigrating to Israel. So why this change? Why suddenly we have Jews coming from Central Europe at this time? Well, I need to, maybe remind us of what's going on. The reason many of those Jews are coming from Central Europe is because a great cloud of darkness has fallen on the Jews of Europe. We need to really keep in mind that in 1933, right, Adolf Hitler is appointed as Germany's chancellor, and the Nazi Party takes sole control of the government. The Weimar Republic collapses, and Hitler installs himself as absolute totalitarian dictator over what is now known as the Third Reich. And so Jews begin to flee German-speaking countries. We have to see how the histories are going to start to run parallel. And so these immigrants of the fifth Aliyah, maybe because they came from more abundant countries, bring with them greater financial power. And so this fifth Aliyah is known to be, as far as the economy is concerned, the most successful in the history of Zionism. And with that huge Aliyah, we see that urban markets expand rapidly. That allows agricultural production to actually sell their produce at decent prices. They have more customers. I mean, literally their customer base is doubled over 3 years. So most of the agricultural production is sold at good prices as well. Businesses are turning profits. Loans are paid back in full. Cities are booming and grow exponentially at that time. And it's exactly also the time where British investments in the land infrastructure is paying off, because they open in 1933 a new ultra-modern, at the time, ultra-modern deep port in Haifa. Do they do that from the goodness of their heart? No. No. The reason they needed a deep sea traffic port is that that's where the pipeline from Iraq to the Mediterranean Sea, that's where it ends. It ends exactly in the port of Haifa. And they needed the port to be completed as the pipeline was completed, in order to have a flow of oil readily available to Europe from the Arab lands. So all of that gets completed in 1933, 1934, and Haifa as a city obviously blossoms in ways that it never had before. And so economically, things are looking up. Politically, the picture is not as bright. As things started to turn dire for German Jews at that time, Zionism comes to realize that it hadn't been successful. There is a great chishbon nefesh, we say in Hebrew. There's a great accounting of the soul searching in the ranks of Zionism, in that conflagration of looking at what's going on in Germany, where things are going from bad to worse every moment of every day. And the Zionist is, especially the leadership of the Zionist movement, is scratching their heads, wondering how come they are not, can't be as successful as they had wished to be at convincing diaspora Jews of the necessity of the state in Zion, of the necessity of the Zionist movement. And how come they are suddenly faced with this very stark realization? Well, they realize that this, German-speaking aliyah, right, this German-speaking wave of immigration that is part of this fifth wave of immigration, though it was about at its peak between 32 and 35, 25%, let's say, of all immigration, right, in one specific year at its peak, right, it only accounted for 9,000 Jews in that year, especially in the year 1933. 9,000 Jews. The year where Hitler came into power, the year where the German economy was in tatters, the year where the Great Depression was in its fourth year of ravaging the Western world. Even with all that, Zionism still didn't capture the imagination of the Jewish masses. Definitely not in Central Europe. I mean, we know from history that the Jews who came from Eastern Europe, first of all, very few came to Israel. Most came to America, came to Western Europe. I mean, I talked about my grandmother for the fourth Aliyah, right? This Polish immigration, right? My grandmother and her family didn't decide to go to Israel. They decided to go to Paris, right? That's where they resettled. They turned to France. So even the Jews that came from Eastern Europe to Israel, they really came out of a sense of desperation, right? It was not really their first choice. It was actually not their first choice. The Jewish masses that came, not in the tens of thousands at first, in the very thousands at first, right? They were small minorities, mostly of poor, uneducated Jewish people who were escaping death, persecution, violence, and they were the few who understood that going somewhere else in Europe wasn't going to help. So they were very few. And now that Hitler is in power, now that we start to see what's going on in Germany, the Zionists are pondering how come only 9,000 Jews in 1933 are leaving German-speaking countries where they should be living by the tens or hundreds of thousands. And so they realized that their vision hadn't caught on, right? That Palestine was definitely not a destination of choice. It was a destination of no choice. but it wasn't really a destination of choice. And for the Zionist leadership, this stark realization was both a very bitter pill to swallow, but also, again, because they were built, understand that they were built on that notion that that Jews of Europe had no future there. That's the whole premise of Theodor Herzl's creating the Zionist movement. So the Zionists always held that notion that Europe was a death trap for the Jews since the late 1880s. So they knew it, and they were watching it, and they were watching it happen every day. And so they saw, perhaps more clearly than anyone else, the dark future that was ahead. So politically, those were very dark times, even if economically things were doing great in Palestine. All right, we now are part 3, which is really the crux of the evening. Part 3 is the Arab Revolt of 1936. Yes, another revolt. If we look back at the riots of 1920, 1921, if we look back at the riots and the violence of 1929, we would say that though it left deep scars in the psyche of the Jewish population of Palestine, it wasn't a deal breaker. It wasn't a deal breaker. These scars could have healed in time. There was still the possibility of, for the Zionist enterprise, for the Jewish people there was still a sense that things could be mended, that we could arrive at consensus, that we could live side by side with the Arabs, despite the violence that already took place. We could move past that. The armed revolts of 1936, many scholars and historians agree, is truly the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back and the point of no return in the Jewish-Arab conflict that has unraveled until this very day. Now, I highly recommend a book by Oren Kessler called Palestine 1936, The Great Revolt and the Root of the Middle East Conflict. Right? Palestine 1936, The Great Revolt and the Root in the Middle East Conflict by Oren Kessler. It's not too thick of a book, but it's a deeply scholarly book that is a critical historical piece of writing that really eliminates what I'm calling the point of no return. And it's part of the history of Jewish-Palestine relations that, unless you are steeped in that history, nobody knows about. I'm gonna say that 99% of you on the call had no reason to know about the 1936, the Great Revolt of 1936. But obviously, I'm not going to read the book to you. If you're interested, you can go and read it. It's not going to be included in the excerpts for the course, so it's an extra. But if that's a topic that you really are passionate about and really, really want to understand why we are where we are today, this is like one of the great building blocks of understanding it. So we call it the revolt of 1936, but really the revolt lasted for 3 years. Three years. And you understand why, probably you have a sense of why it ended in 1939, because something else started in 1939. But yes, it lasted for 3 years. And with the seed of that were planted by the Mufti that I explained earlier, the revolt, as we will see, that he fostered, again, that he was 100% responsible for, this time actually, as you will see, completely premeditated, right? These 3 years, this revolt was really the cauldron, if you want, into which the Palestinian identity was shaped and the seeds of a Jewish army were planted. So, Palestinian identity, Jewish army. Those are the two, basically, outgrowth of the revolt. So the revolt itself obviously didn't happen in a vacuum. By the 1930s, as we saw, Britain had loosened its grip on Iraq, loosened its grip on Transjordan, giving more and more leeway and authority to the kings that it had appointed there. And one can say that it had also mostly relinquished any power over Egypt. That, understand that Britain had occupied Egypt since 1882, right? So Britain had been ruling over Egypt for 50 years at that point, over 50 years at that point. But over the last few years, it had kind of disengaged itself. And, France, since that's the other great power present in the Middle East, we can say that for all intent and purposes, France had done basically the same, with yielding back most of the governing and the authority over Lebanon and Syria to the Arab local population. And because of this disengagement, both from France and from Britain, who were really now only at the periphery of the Middle East, except for the British mandate in Palestine, that retraction, that distancing of those two great powers, basically left the doors open for other European countries to come in and start to woo the Arab world. Benito Mussolini, who was Italy's fascist dictator at the time, Benito Mussolini had an eye toward North Africa, Libya, Ethiopia. He was looking at Tunisia, which was French at the time. He was eyeing Egypt, since Britain was on its way out or had disengaged. So Mussolini and Italy had a keen eye onto North Africa, and Hitler looked to the Middle East to flip the Arab world's allegiance to France and Britain, and with a strategic aim to cut off both the French and the British Empire from their Asian territorial connections. So Mussolini aimed especially to fight France and Great Britain and the British Empire in North Africa. Nazi Germany is looking at the Middle East to cut off the empires from their Asian parts of the empire. And so the Nazi propaganda department begins to finance great Arab projects in the Middle East. A lot of Nazi money comes to finance new schools in those Arab lands. New institutes are created. Suddenly, newspapers flourish in the Arab world. All of this with the aim, and I quote, to further educational activities in the Muslim world, but really mostly to try and convince Arab masses and their leadership of, how do we put this, of like the shared ideological alignment between the Nazis and the Arabs. The shared ideological alignment, the shared nationalistic project that they were both investing in. And above all, their shared enemies. Right? Nothing brings people together more than defining who their shared enemies are. And in this case, the French and the British, that the Nazis were very good at saying that the Arab needed to, get from under the yoke of, and of course, their greatest shared enemy, the Jews. Not a Nazi-financed Arab newspaper was ever published without carrying the translated Nazi anti-Jewish propaganda in all of its pages. In no time, Arab nationalist movements suddenly proliferated across the Middle East, and all of them, to some degree or another, adopted wholesale Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda. Now, paradoxically, as Nazi Germany quickly declared itself the patron of the Arab world, all of their anti-Jewish persecutions, anti-Jewish laws that really multiplied after the Nuremberg laws were enacted in 1935. Paradoxically, all of the anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish persecutions brought more and more Jews to immigrate to Palestine. So on one hand, they were telling the Arabs that they were the champions, of their cause, anti-French, anti-British, anti-Jewish. But at the same time, what was going on in Germany was bringing more Jews to their lands. By 1939, 275,000 Jews, and that's not a small number, and that's really significant because it's 1939. 275,000 Jews were able to flee from the German Reich, and about the same number fled the persecution of Eastern Europe from Poland, Hungary, and Romania. And so, paradoxically, once again, I'm using that word a lot, it seems, today, the massive arrival of Jewish refugees, of fugitives of persecution from Europe, including Nazi Germany, becomes the main cause of the Arab unrest, who argued, especially the Mufti, that seeing so many Jews arriving in Palestine, they argued to the British Parliament, to the British power, that they said, look, it looks like, the Jews have come back. The mandate has been fulfilled. There's really is, at this point, de facto, a Jewish national home. Look how many Jews are here. The Jewish national home, even if it's not really declared officially, again, that's the Mufti and the Arab leadership arguing, even though it's not been really declared officially, it is a fait accompli on the ground. And so the Arab demands are that it would be fair, 1935, it would be fair to, at this point, to declare that the mandate is over and to give the Arabs of Palestine the same independence that Britain and France had already granted to the other Arab states that were in their control. And so Arab nationalists publish one article after another, appealing to the Arab masses, again, listen to the words, to revolt against the Zionists and their British patrons. Right? It's the same. You really have to listen, right, carefully. And you'll see that it's not expressly stated, even in Sachar's book. But if you can really perceive and read when these words are on the page, what is behind that, right? It's echoing the again, that story that the Arab Palestinian leadership, especially the Mufti, is crafting, right? It is time to revolt against the Zionists and their British patrons and wage a jihad, a holy war to liberate Palestine, lest they soon, will find themselves a minority in their own land. Look at all these Jews that are coming. Throw into the mix, of course, never forget. Again, I said all the parallel things are now coming together, right? The anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that have now been spread for several years through these newspapers, pages of the Arab newspapers, where it will sound very apropos to what's going on. The claims are that the Arabs must be afraid of the Zionists, of the Jews, who are being incited to kill all Arabs. Right? The Jews will come and kill all Arabs. The Jews are here to push all the Arabs into the sea. They are attacking and raping and torturing Arab women. I mean, if you know the Nazi propaganda of the time, and especially the Nuremberg laws, and within that the sexual laws, you can hear echoes of that. So between that and, like I mentioned earlier, the adoption of Nazi propaganda, the hatred of the Jews and the Zionist movement spreads like wildfire throughout not just Palestine, but in the states around Palestine. Add to the mix, there's always more. The incredibly religious xenophobia of the Mufti of Jerusalem, and through him of his followers. And you get a Molotov cocktail of fear, anger, and hatred with a fuse ready to be lit. And the Mufti lit the fuse in April 1936 with the murder of 2 Jews. But this time, the Yishuv, the Jewish community, retaliates, and in tit for tat responds by killing 2 Arabs. And what follows is widespread chaos throughout the land. As soon as things really start to get out of hand, the British administration steps in, imposes a curfew on all of Palestine's larger cities, and promulgates immediately emergency regulations. But Hajj Amin was ready. The Mufti was ready. Like I said, this time he wasn't random. He was deeply premeditated. And as the British responds, trying to stop the violence, he immediately calls for a national strike and for all Arabs to immediately withhold paying any kind of taxes, especially this is April, and the annual taxes actually at the time at the land, it was May 15th. So to not pay the May 15th annual taxes. It turns to the High Commissioner of the Mandate in Palestine, and demands immediate termination of all Jewish immigration to Palestine. And he has planned this. He has built a war chest enough to hold the strike for 7 months. That's what he has. He immediately sends his gangs throughout the land to ensure that the strike is strictly followed by every Arab in the land. And by doing that, he cripples the government and all public transportation. Now remember that the British mandate did not employ Jews, or very rarely and very few. Overwhelmingly, the British mandate was employing Arab workforce. So once the strike starts, the government almost collapses, and all public transportation and all public offices shattered. No Arab business is allowed to be open, and no Arab is allowed to work on farming. And that's going to last for months. What are the consequences of that? Is that the Jews are doing really well, because now they are the only ones who can be depended upon to continue supporting the economy. So the Jewish economy was absolutely booming during that time, and there are basically no Jewish unemployment throughout these months. But the fighting intensifies by midsummer, mostly through Hajj Amin, the Mufti of Jerusalem, through his gangs, through his groups of armed rebels, through the establishment of what's called the Committee for the Defense of Palestine. So there's a Committee for the Defense of Palestine that is established, not in Palestine itself, but in neighboring Arab countries. Neighboring Arab countries create this new organization, the Committee for the Defense of Palestine, and through this new organization, they're able to fundraise and arm anyone and every Arab who would want to go into Palestine to fight. And so you have hundreds of fighting volunteers armed by those satellite states, Arab states, pouring into the land. And the British obviously understand what's going on, and by the end of the summer, watching those wave of soldiers coming in from everywhere, they mobilized their 20,000 soldiers that were there, and prepare a full-on military campaign to quash the rebellion, while at the same time, London has sent 10,000 more troops on their way to the Promised Land. This was going to be a major clash, in the fall of the year. By that time, the strike was then in its 6th month, and the Arab population really could not endure any more of it. The Mufti and his followers came to the conclusion that this time the violence had not yielded what he expected, and so the Mufti looked, in fact, for a way to end it in a way that he wouldn't lose face, and that he would feel that he could proclaim victory, even though he never really won anything but the death of Palestinians mostly. The High Commissioner of the Mandate meets him and offers him exactly that, a way to save face. Having shown the British military stick, he now offers the Mufti the carrot of ending the revolt in exchange of dispatching yet another royal commission that would listen to his demands. The deal was accepted by the Mufti on October 11th, and both the strike and the violence ended, and all the imported volunteer fighters from other Arab lands, as part of the deal, were allowed to return home quietly. Okay. End of part 3. Part 4, the aftermath of this 7-month revolt. I call it part 4, the Peel Commission. The Royal Peel, P-E-E-L, the Royal Peel Commission arrives in Jerusalem in November 1936, tasked once again with determining the causes of the unrest, once again to explore the Jews and the Arabs' grievances, and once again to make recommendation to the Crown for the future of the British mandate in Palestine. It's like history repeats itself. Once again, Weizmann, Ben-Gurion, the Zionists cooperate with the Commission. Once again, the Arabs completely boycott anything and everything that has to do with the Peel Commission. Now, you will find in the readings this week a very detailed expose of each party's grievances in Sachar's chapters. So I don't have the time or the space to deal with that right now, because to me, once again, the conclusions and the recommendations of the Peel Commissions that were made public then in July 1937 are what matters most. July 1937. And I'm actually including in this week's readings an excerpt. I think there were about 400 pages of the report, so I'm not sending you 400 pages, but I'm including an excerpt of the report of the Peel Commission in your readings for this session, and it really is worth reading. It's actually, it's a first-hand document, so it's a real document that was read in July 1937 by the people that were very much involved in the conflict, and you get first row seat basically, reading the same words they were reading, and you can draw your own conclusions. But really parse through it. It's quite shocking and devastating. I'm gonna highlight a few things, but I think you'll really enjoy it. It's not very long, so it's one of those you can squeeze between the chapters from Sachar's book. What the report concluded, and that's important, so I'm going to dwell on that tonight. What the report concluded was that based on the unsurmountable and irreconcilable grievances and requirement of each party, only a division of Palestine into 2 separate self-governing entities could solve this intractable problem. That is shockwave. This is the first time in all of the history of the British Mandate where somebody finally looks reality in the eye and comes back to say the only move forward, the only way we can solve this is if there are 2 states in this land, a Jewish state and an Arab state, created side by side. And the Peel Commission report states clearly, you'll read it, and I'm paraphrasing, that though no side will be completely satisfied, partition offers more advantages to both camps than there are downsides. And so there was real, I mean, it was a real like reality check, if you want. And with the report and with the recommendation of two states, the Peel Commission, based on their survey of the land, for the first time defined what those two states could look like. They drew a map, actually, the first map of the partition of Palestine into two states. Of course, we have the map, and I'm going to share it with you. It'll be emailed to you tomorrow, and you have plenty of time to look at it. But I'm going to share it with you tonight so we can all look at it together. What was the recommendation in 1937? It's also very important. It's 1937 of a two-state solution in the land of Palestine. Here's what they came up with. This is what the recommendation was. Let's see if I can make it bigger. Is there a way for me to make it bigger? I don't know. I have lost control of my mouse. Can everybody share that? Just do thumb up if you can see it. Okay, there's something not working.
It's not showing up on the screen.
Yeah, something is frozen. My computer just froze. See, with all that I have done for this moment, now I am completely frozen out of my computer. Oh, come on. You can do this. All right, it seems you can still hear me. Come on, computer. This is not fun.
I can hear you and I can see you in a little box.
Yes, that's
and
a good
it says Rabbi Olivier has started screen sharing.
Yeah.
But yeah.
But nothing. We're gonna wait another minute. This is so critical that I can't really move forward without sharing that. This is very sad. What's going on right now?
Can you stop screen sharing and then start again?
I can only move my mouse around, but nothing else is moving at all.
Can you control Alt Delete?
I just tried to do that, and that doesn't do anything either. Okay. I don't know what to do from here. So,
Rabbi, can you make somebody else host and then
there's nothing I can do.
The rabbi has left the building.
I see that. Sometimes people, I mean, can make somebody else co-host and then go out of Zoom and then come back in is what I've seen.
Yeah, I think his computer completely crashed.
Yeah. So mine did that earlier today too. It didn't crash, it froze.
Mhm.
Or maybe he logged out and he's going to log back in. See if he
Well,
can
it's
get
very important because we can't move forward without seeing and hearing what this next piece is. So
Yeah.
I think I could take this class 10 times.
That's absolutely the truth. Yeah.
Mhm.
I can't believe he has mastery of these details.
Oh,
I
God.
don't, I don't know
Incredible.
how many terabytes he has
Mhm.
in his brain.
Yes.
He's a smart cookie. Hmm.
Okay, Rabbi Olivier is coming back. His computer froze. He's restarting. So everyone just hang tight.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Melissa.
Melissa.
Thank you.
We're not going anywhere. We're attached.
Yeah, we ain't going nowhere.
Well, I'm glad Melissa's still listening so she can help with the fix.
Melissa is shepherding us.
Well, it's just nice to chat with each other.
I'm learning so much from these lectures.
He's an amazing teacher, really. I've never taken a class from him that wasn't just jaw-dropping. Yeah. So that's a good sign.
Something new.
Yeah, it
It's a
said
good
Rabbi
sign.
Rabbi
Mhm.
Olivier is the host now.
Mhm.
He's connecting. I see him.
You do?
He's the last little box. If you go to
He says it's going very slowly. So just hang tight just a little bit longer, I think.
Okay.
When computers are tired, the restart can be slow.
Yeah.
Wait,
Wait.
Yep.
here he is again. He's muted. Yeah, Olivia, it shows that you're muted on our little screens. There you are.
Oh, it's back.
Hello.
I bet he's talking.
You're
to Melissa.
muted.
No, but he's talking on the phone.
Okay,
Hmm?
thanks.
Working on it.
Okay, we're here. We're back.
Yay.
All right. Just
We've
my
got a little dialogue.
a whole cycle of all right. I'm hoping it's still live stream.
Yes,
Yeah?
yes.
Good.
Yes, including our little checking in with each other about your encyclopedic knowledge.
Yeah, we had a conversation going while you were gone.
All right, I'm going to do again what I was just trying to do.
Good luck.
So the Peel Commission and the plan and the partition plan for the first time in history, right? That that somebody's moving a real tangible project forward and said we can only solve this if we have two states. And here's the map. God willing, you're going to see it now. of what they proposed. All right, so I'm going to try again. Share screen. So far, so good. Share. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, this is working. Wonderful. Let me see if I can make it a little bigger so that everybody can really see it. Okay, we see it?
Yes.
Good. This is the partition plan that the Peel Commission is proposing in July of 1937. The area in black is the proposed Jewish state. As you can see, it includes all the coast, most of the coast, Mediterranean coast,
And the Galilee.
and all the Galilee. The Arab state, basically the place is divided in three, right? It's divided in three. You have in the black part where the Jews were supposed to be. In the grayish part, that was going to be the Arab state. And they were little enclaves that are in white, where the British were still going to keep control. So you can see right smack in the middle. So Jerusalem was going to remain under British control. So was Bethlehem, right? And all the way to the port of Jaffa on the Mediterranean Sea. Tel Aviv, which is literally 10 yards from Jaffa, was already in the Jewish state, or the proposed Jewish state. Okay. Haifa, because of the port, was also under British rule, and Nazareth was, as a Christian site, was also going to remain under British control. So those three parts of the two-state solution. And there was a caveat to that the British offered for the king of Transjordan, for Abdullah, to actually rule over the Arab part of the state, of the proposed state, right? So basically Transjordan would expand into Palestine, and, you know, even though it would be maybe semi-autonomous and would be unique, it would still be ruled by the king, right? So the king would have rule over Arab Palestine. Now, do you see, I don't know if you're like me, but the Jewish state, if you know Israel, looks incredibly small.
Yes.
You can stay muted at this point. The Jewish state looks incredibly small. And it's hard for us to fathom, but really between like the thin sliver of black, the black line against the sea, that is maybe 5 miles. That's maybe 5, maybe 10 miles at the most. Right? You can also see that because of the British enclave in Jaffa to Jerusalem and Bethlehem, the state is split into two parts. There is the southern part below the British enclave, and then there is a northern part above. So it's also not a contiguous state. The Arab state is contiguous, not the Jewish state. By any means, this is militarily, almost impossible to defend. I mean, it's almost impossible to defend. It's too thin. There is no room to stop any kind of determined attack, right? Just to give us a sense of perspective, I'm going to share another map. And that's also fascinatingly interesting. I'm going to share this map, just to give us a sense of perspective, how big the state that the Peel Commission was offering actually was. And we put that in the context of this being the British mandate, right? So this is how big the state actually is. The Jewish state proposed how big it actually is. This is how big it would be. Do you see it? It's in the bottom of the page here. But that's compared to Britain, what the offer was for a Jewish state, split into two. Right? I want us to just be with that and understand what was proposed. Okay, so keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. What we saw on the map, that Palestine and Transjordan were now divided into those three areas, right? What we don't see on this map that I shared with you is that the Jewish part of the map, especially around the cities of Haifa and some towns in the Galilee, would include 200,000 Arab residents. There would be no Jewish residents on the other side, maybe a few thousand. Maybe, I think the estimates were like 1,000, maybe 1,500 Jews in the way that it's designed. But 200,000 Arab would still be part of the Jewish state. So what was the response to the proposed partition plan? Because the report was, ultimately was the most realistic proposal that ever was put forward. And this idea of partition was a breakthrough, could have been a breakthrough, really, in this moment. Especially, remember, this is July 1937, right? Think about historically, you have to put that in the historical context. What is going on in the Jewish world in July of 1937? This is 2 years, just 2 years before the outbreak of the Second World War, right? July 1937, at this incredibly critical time, the Peel Commission says we could do this. We could split the populations in two and give the Jews their state, and we can give the Arabs their state. The response was, on the Arab side,
That's good.
I'm going to mute everybody again. Can you please just mute yourself? That would be great. Thank you. On the Arab side, the Nashashibi family, the Nashashibi clan, has aligned itself with King Abdullah of Transjordan, right? And together, the Nashashibi and Abdullah see the plan, especially because, Abdullah is included in very powerful ways and told that he would rule over that part of the land. They react extremely positively to the partition plan. They're really happy about this. The Nashashibi, in fact, the Nashashibi family could see that Hajj Amin and the Husseini clan could now come under Abdullah's rule. And since Abdullah was already aligned with the Nashashibi, they were very delighted in the prospect of basically reversing the power structure in Palestine. And Abdullah himself, of course, was very much in favor of expanding his kingdom, not just because he would have a bigger territory, but because if you know the geography of the Middle East, the areas west of the Jordan, with the Galilee, but other parts of the central part of Israel, which would come under his governing, those are the most prosperous and arable parts of the land. Jordan, as it is known today, Transjordan at the time, was pretty much, and still is pretty much, a huge desert. So King Abdullah is seeing the possibility of growing his economy by integrating that part of Palestine into his kingdom. Now, do you remember, however, what I said when I used this analogy about, historical dominoes, and how historical dominoes are set and suddenly they fall, and it feels that there is a certain historical process that cannot be stopped because of the dominoes that were put in place over time. And then history follows the trajectory it can't avoid to follow. The first domino that we see here is the British splitting Palestine and Transjordan. That might have been one of their greatest mistakes. We understand why they did that. We understand that it probably wanted to placate the Hussein of Mecca, the Sharif of Mecca, to give his sons rule over half of the Middle East. We understand why they wanted to do that. They wanted maybe somebody else to rule, so they wouldn't have to spread their armies too thin. There were all kinds of reasons. But had they not done that, this partition plan could have been accepted, because that part of Palestine would always have been under the rule of King Abdullah. But that's not what they did. They split it. They drew that border at the Jordan River. And they said, no, Transjordan is east of the river. The rest, we're going to manage it, right? The second domino was the High Commissioner, Herbert Samuel, if you remember, who imposed against the will of the Palestinian people of the time, against the voting that happened, and Hajj Amin of the Husseini family came fourth in those elections. I'm sure you read those passages in the books. Despite him having lost the election, not just lost, like came a near second, but came fourth in the election, Herbert Samuel decided against all that to appoint him as the Mufti of Jerusalem, right? And in the moment he becomes the Mufti of Jerusalem, he engaged in an incredible grab for power, creates gangs. I mean, I call them gangs, but you can call them whatever you want. Creates a mini army around him, starts to align himself with the Nazis, use the Nazi propaganda as his own propaganda, disseminates anger and rage throughout the kingdom to prop himself up. By the time the Peel Commission comes over, he's not going to relinquish anything. He has created unofficially his own kingdom of Palestine. He's not going to give it up. And so he flatly rejects the partition plan, obviously. And because of his militias, he already has instilled great fear in the Arab population. There were actually two, if I remember correctly, two attempts on the life of Abdullah from the Husseini family's militias. Right? He has instilled so much fear that Armstrong, basically, both Abdullah and the Nashashibi family, to publicly reject the plan as well, by pure threat, really, on their lives. I mean, you could call it anything else you want, political manipulation, but literally threat on their lives as well. And you will read more about Hajj Amin's really ferocious radicalism in the chapters on Sachar this week. And he describes him, or there's a passage where he's described as having this quasi-messianic vision of himself, his claim of leadership over the Arab nationalist movement. It's vividly described in the book as well. And so that's the other domino, right? You split Palestine. You installed against the will of the Arab people this radical leader at the helm, and that's how history unfolds, right? Following that, both the Iraqi and the Syrian government align themselves with the Mufti of Jerusalem. They also reject the plan, and I show your hand and I raise you. So they raise the rejection and call Zionism a cancer that must be immediately eradicated in favor of an Arab state, right? Think about that, because that, has not changed. That has not changed. The Pan-Arab Congress of September 1937, at this point emboldened by the support of the Axis powers of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, goes so far as to threaten Britain and warn that the Arab nations will turn their back on the Western democracies in favor of new alliances facilitated, in fact, by the Nazis, who behind the curtains were promising large quantity of arms to all of those little despots in all of those newly founded countries. And the Axis propaganda, Nazi and Italian propaganda, using this new thing called the radio to propagate those ideals through the Arab world, drilled into the minds of the Arab world to reject British and French colonial imperialism and Zionism as a British instrument, right? Again, the same. So now the Nazis are piggybacking on the Mufti, unless the Mufti was influenced by the Nazis, right? In their propaganda around the radio wave throughout the Middle East, North Africa. And the propaganda says to reject British and French colonial imperialism and Zionism as a British colonial instrument, right? So think about when we hear on the streets the propaganda of the Hamas being mouthed by good white people in the streets of America that call Israel a colonial settler project. It comes all the way back to Nazi propaganda and the Mufti's alliance with the Nazis to begin to speak of Zionism in those kinds of ways. Because at the time, again, they equated Zionism with the British Empire and the British colonial project. And so it gets transferred onto Zionism. The Mufti was completely sold and declared himself a great admirer of Hitler and Nazism. He went as far as going to Berlin to meet his hero in the middle of the Second World War. There's a really good part in the chapters this week dedicated to the Nazi influence on the Arab world in general and of Palestine in particular. The one thing I would say to you as you open the book and read those chapters is brace yourself. Brace yourself. This is going to be really disturbing stuff. It's really disturbing. The unholy alliance between Nazism and Arab nationalism is really chilling. So this was my, this is not PG-13 material. Just be warned. On the other side, so now we explored all the different parts of the Arab response to the Peel partition plan. On the other side, the Zionist leadership at first expresses very serious reservations, and Jabotinsky, again, you'll meet him in this week's reading, who is, on the right, like I mentioned earlier, rejected the plan altogether. But neither the leadership of the Zionist movement nor Jabotinsky were the deciding factors. They were not. Weizmann and Ben-Gurion were the deciding factor. What they said went. What they said goes. And think about it. They both accepted the plan. You saw what was offered. You saw how small, how indefensible what they were given, what they were offered was. And yet they said, yes, they said, we will do it. We can do this. We'll start with whatever they give us. They argued that these were dire times for the Jews of Europe. They had no choice. They felt that they had no choice. They had to take whatever was offered. The Jews were in an absolute despair, desperately needed a state, any shape of any form, which could give the Jews enough sovereignty that it could absorb refugees fleeing the Nazi persecutions. And so they, small as it was, small as it might have been, they said yes. And they were the deciding factors. And so why is it also critical? Is that because there was a possibility in the summer of 1937, 2 years before the war, of the state of Israel to have come into existence. Can you imagine? I'm getting emotional. The vision of Weizmann and Ben-Gurion, who saw what was coming and said, give us anything, but give us a space where we can bring our people into safety now. And so 2 years before the war, that could have happened. Now, we hear always the accusations, mostly dropped via the adopted radical Islam propaganda, that the Jews were given a state because of the nation's guilt after the war and after the Holocaust. That is not the case. That is absolutely not the case. First of all, nothing was given to us. I don't know if you paid attention to this story and to this history. There was nothing given. Nothing. And it was definitely not because of the war and the Holocaust that the great nations, the great Western nations decided out of the goodness of our heart that now it was time, to give the Jews a state. 2 years before the war, it was right there. It was offered. There was a plan. There was an agreement. The British had signed off on it. The Jews, Weizmann and Ben-Gurion, had signed off on it. And it's in fact the ramping up to the war, not the war and the after war, but the ramping up to the war that in fact prevented it from happening. That is what stopped it. The Nazis take over from British influence of the Arab world, as we will see, and the literal threat of the Arab world to reverse its alliance away from the British crown weighed enormously on London on the eve of World War II, as they were completely enthralled in the delusion of appeasement. And as they were enthralled in this delusion of appeasement, both towards the Axis dictators and the Arab leaders, the leading up to the war stopped the British from imposing the plan on the Middle East. It was the geopolitical concerns of that year, not the Holocaust of years later, that torpedoed the coming into existence of the State of Israel and the possibility of saving hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Jews, actually. I know I'm running late tonight, but we need to close this, and we had a little interlude. So this is recorded. If it's late for you, you're welcome to finish it with the recording at a later time, but I'm going to keep going. Part 5. The Arab Revolt returns. On Sunday, September 26, 1937, British District Commissioner of the Galilee and a Zionist supporter, there were not a lot of them in the British government in the mandate. On Sunday morning, September 26, 1937, Louis Andrews was assassinated by Arab militants in Nazareth, on his way to church. He was going to church Sunday morning, Nazareth. What do you do on Sunday morning in Nazareth? You go to church. He was assassinated on his way to church. The British figured out that it was the forces of the Mufti, whom else, who organized and carried out this assassination. In retaliation, they dissolved the Mufti-led Supreme Muslim Council. They dissolved the Arab Higher Committee that he presided over, and they went after him. He fled and retreated in the Mosque of Omar and the Golden Dome, the Golden Dome in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount, where all the mosques are. And then, dressed as a woman, escaped the streets of Jerusalem, fled to Lebanon, and from Lebanon ended up eventually in Syria. But the Arab revolt had started once again, or restarted. And actually it intensified even more in the 2 years that followed. And this time targeting both Jews and British personnel. And so pushing the British armed forces to finally go on the offensive. And during the repression, some 5,000 Arabs were killed and 15,000 were wounded. But what we don't know, what is not often shared, is that half of those casualties were actually between Arab factions killing each other. The victims at first were members of the Nashibi tribe because they didn't participate in the rebellion, and so the Husseini enacted vengeance upon them for not supporting them. But then after that, they themselves retaliated, not only by informing on the Husseinis' whereabouts and cooperating with the British, but they even created defensive militias of their own who hunted down rebels loyal to the Husseinis. And so terror was rampant in all of Palestine. And the reason, the consequence of that is that many Arabs sold their lands to the Jews and fled Palestine to escape the violence. But that didn't stop anything, because the hunt between the two families continued even beyond the borders of Palestine. Nashashibi family members were killed wherever they went, in Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, you name it, and the same for the Husseini families. The feud continued even beyond the borders. The Nashashibi tried to enroll the help of the British forces and offered them to unite the Arabs of Palestine under their own rule, pretexting that the Mufti was in exile, so there was an opportunity to change who was ruling. But the British at this point, they refused to help them because they felt that the Nashashibi or the Husseini, they were two sides of the same coin. They were both just as radical and violent, and there was no reason to side more with one family than at this point than with the other. And remember, this time also, as in previous times, and it's important to note that neither the Christian Arabs nor the Druze population joined the revolt. Part 6, and this is the last part. I'm looking at my notes. This is the last part of our session tonight. Part 6, and perhaps the most devastating, although it hasn't been a very joyful tonight at all. But part 6, I named it Britain Abandons the Jews. And I'm very sensitive to, there's a great book actually called The Abandonment of the Jews. It's a book about how the Western world abandoned the Jews on the eve of World War II. And so I'm kind of piggybacking on that notion. And I'm very sensitive to that right now because I'm feeling the history is repeating itself. Not that I want to get into politics, but there is a great sense of our government right now being enthralled in policies of appeasement that is very disturbing. I'll close this parenthesis, but just keep in mind, because history repeats itself in front of our eyes. So part 6, last part. Britain abandons the Jews. So not to borrow from a famous historical figure, but in our darkest hour, Britain reneged on its commitment to the Jews of Palestine. As always, as you may have already predicted, London's response to every Arab revolt was to send yet another royal commission. Every time, the report of each commission had more and more disastrous consequences for the Jews, who were never responsible for any revolt. But this time, contrary to what had happened before, as I said, the previous revolt could have been healed. We could have moved past this one. We can't move beyond this one, because the consequences of what follows these revolts is most dire. So this time, after the renewed revolt, there's another commission that is sent. This time it's called the Woodhead Commission. This one arrives in April 1938. And following the Peel Commission, their job was to establish a final partition plan for both an Arab and Jewish state. As always, the Arab boycott. As always, the Jews participate. This time, since the Arabs were not taking part, the very anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic British mandate officers decide that they are going to be the voice for the Arabs of Palestine. So that's how the commission interviews people. The Jews on one hand, and the British administrators on the other hand, who are tasked with making the case for the Arabs. By the spring of 1938, just keep in mind that by the spring of March 1938 is the Anschluss. March 1938 is when the Nazi armies march unimpeded into Austria and take over Austria. Right? So now it's not just the German Jews, not just the Sudetenland. Now it's also Austria. So more and more Jews are falling under the boot of Nazi Germany, right? The spring of 1938, this is when this commission is sent to Israel, to Palestine, right? At that time, a growing number of Jews, most of the Jews of Germany, and now most of the Jews, if not all the Jews of Austria and Germany, have become homeless, indigent pariah in their former land. Many are hunted down. Most of them are already rounded up and sent to concentration camps. Poland, Romania, and Hungary are following suit. Immigration is now a matter of life and death for the Jews in most of Europe. An international conference in Evian, the International Conference for Refugees, is meeting in Evian in July 1938. Evian is where the water bottles are made, is in France. They meet in Evian to talk about what are we going to do with what's going on and all the refugees coming. All the nations present discuss the refugee crisis that is exploding in Europe, discuss obviously the Jewish refugees issues. All but one country, the Dominican Republic, that's the only one country, except the Dominican Republic, every other country of the world refused categorically to make any modification, any change, any expansion to what has become a very strict immigration quotas on behalf of the refugees, on behalf of the Jew. America had closed its doors already 10 years ago. Nothing, no country budges, but the Dominican Republic. Wow. At Evian, in the conference, it's become clear to the Zionists, to the leadership, that the world has now closed its doors and turned its back on the Jews. As Nazism grew into greater threat, Arab friendship grew into greater British focus. a greater British need. And the Zionists felt it. They felt the ground disappearing from under them. Chamberlain spent that summer pursuing this appeasement policy and reached, as we know, quote unquote, peace for our time in September of that year through this agreement with Hitler. And so the Jews knew that a shift of policy in Palestine was coming. The Woodhead Commission report declared that the partition plan was impossible and made recommendation to kind of the same, but much smaller. I mean, slightly smaller. And it, out of nowhere, raised the question that if we were to do that, then the partitioned Arab part of the deal would not be a viable state because it wouldn't have the help of the Jews, the economy, the economic support of the Jews. So that was the problem they raised. It's like we could do the partition plan, we could have a smaller Jewish state yet, but the problem will be that the Arabs need the Jews. So they recommended actually that it be imposed that the two states would be forced to economically support each other. Right? That was the wording. Basically, they were saying to the Jews, we'll give you a smaller state and you're going to be in charge of helping the Palestinians thrive. This time, there was no possibility of accepting it. Even Weizmann and Ben-Gurion said this is not possible. And actually, some scholars argue that the British offered this unacceptable plan on purpose, because they wanted to pretend that they did something, and so that they could impose what was coming next. And in fact, just 2 days after the publication of the Commission's report, the British government issued yet another white paper. And in that white paper, they rejected any notion of partition, any possible notion of partition. This time, no diplomacy could work. This time, the Arab had won. This time, violence had prevailed. This time, violence gave the Arab what they wanted. By early 1939, so just a few months before the war, the British squeezed Jewish immigration to Palestine to a trickle. They rejected a Zionist plan to rescue 10,000 Jewish children from Central Europe. They rejected saving Jewish children. They rejected it. To them, the calculations were very simple. The drums of war were becoming louder, and their lifeline in the Middle East depended upon the goodwill of the Arabs. And so they felt they had no choice but to ensure that the Arab governments were not going to defect to Hitler and to the Axis powers. And so they turn away from the Zionists and embrace wholeheartedly a pro-Arab stance. They insisted that the Jews accept drastic immigration restrictions for a few years through the war, and then make future immigration quotas dependent on Arab approval. Land sales, that's the white paper, right? Land sales to Jews would be drastically, if not completely, curtailed. And failure to agree, they said to Weizmann, to Ben-Gurion, they said failure to agree, threatening, might cause the British to withdraw from Palestine altogether and to leave the Jews at the mercy of the Arabs. And you can imagine that the Nazis, in their project, would have been more than happy to arm the Arabs to take care of the Jews right there and then. The Arabs demanded the termination of the mandate and complete independence for Arab Palestine. And the British agreed to their demands in principle, sat down with them to negotiate without any Zionist, any Jew being present in the room, to negotiate with the Arabs what could happen to the Jews in case of Britain agreeing to an independent Arab state. Not a Jew in the room. They negotiated with the Arab about the life or death of the Jews in Palestine. Obviously, the Jews opposed any such a plan. And when they did, listen to this, when they did, the British colonial secretary went so far, that's March 1939. I mean, it's unbelievable. Threatened that failure to agree was threatening the rise of anti-Semitism that could be revived in Britain itself. The colonial secretary of the British Empire threatened the Jews that there could be a government-incited wave of anti-Semitism in Britain against the Jews of Britain if the Zionists wouldn't agree to the conditions. I mean, it's unbelievable, unbelievable. And on the flip side of that, I mean, I understand that the propaganda on the Arab side is that we're the hands and the arms of the British colonial project and empire, right? That's their propaganda. And from our side, we're threatening of complete death and violence by the British government itself, right? I mean, the dissonance of that is quite mind-blowing. On May 17, 1939, just 4 months before the outbreak of the war, there's another white paper published by the British. And the white paper statement admitted that, I'm paraphrasing, of course, that the authors of the mandate could not have intended that Palestine should be converted into a Jewish state against the will of the Arab population. No, it offered then a one-state solution to be put in place within 10 years. A one-state solution put in place within 10 years that would limit Jewish immigration to 10,000 people per year, plus 25,000 refugees for the first 5 years. And after that, like in the previous white paper, it would be left at the discretion of the Arabs to set the quotas of Jewish immigration. And this time, the sale of land to Jews was to be immediately prohibited. Not even curtailed, not even diminished, completely and utterly prohibited. This was what we can call it the death knell to the Zionist project at that point. I mean, after such a turnaround of the British government, the British were sealing off Palestine to Jewish immigration exactly at the moment when European Jewry faced a mortal threat. The Jews of Palestine took to the streets immediately. There were riots that flared up now against British forces all over the land. Ben-Gurion himself called for a Jewish revolt, and the Irgun is it's like a radical armed Jewish group, began to bomb several British government buildings in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv. They began to sabotage railways. Ben-Gurion wrote, and I quote, The Jews should act as though they were the state in Palestine and should continue to act until there will be a Jewish state here. And so everywhere, with basically no other option, Jewish resistance was taking shape. There was privately organized clandestine immigration set up to try to save as many Jews from Europe as possible. There were more agricultural settlements that continued to go up. Now they were doing that under cover of darkness. And the Haganah became a secret military force that recruited the special units to fight the British forces. So it's not like we are a colonial state, that we started to fight the colonial powers, right? And so the paradox of accusing us of being a colonial state is just mind-blowing. So, in conclusion, I still want to offer that, yes, all of this happened. We can look at the British reaction and say horrendous, horrible words that I'm not gonna say right now. But if we look at the big picture, like if we really take the 10,000 feet view, right? We still have to ask. What was it not the right thing to do for the Arabs of Palestine to ask for independence? Can we honestly not see the unfolding of this story from their perspective? I mean, remove the extremism of the Mufti. Well, I don't know if you can remove the extremism of the Mufti, but right? I mean, all the other Arabs everywhere around them have been given sovereignty, a state, a land, right? Is it so far-fetched to look at that from their perspective and say, well, what about us, right? Given the givens, can we truly blame the British Empire for strategically siding with the Arab world when faced with the dangers of letting them align with Hitler and against the Allies, when more than ever they needed to protect the roots and the resources of their empire to fight the upcoming war? There is always this debate, right? If the British Empire had sided with the Jews and Ben-Gurion and Weizmann had gotten what they wanted, that had provoked the ire of the Arabs, who would have turned against Britain, armed by the Nazis, could have completely overrun the British forces in Palestine, and therefore decimating, if not genociding, the Jews there. Like we can rewrite history every other way, right? We can say, oh my God, this was an awful thing to do, to turn their back on the Jews in the moment of their dire need. But we can say, and had they in fact not also saved Jewish lives? I mean, it's hard to hold the paradox. It's hard. Bottom line, the Arabs played their cards well and got what they wanted at this point. At this point, obviously, we know that things ultimately will turn out differently. The British, bottom line, did what they believed they had to do, not just to preserve their empire, but in preserving their empire, to allow them to ultimately win the war. And the Jews had the weakest hand in that moment. I mean, when we think about it, they had the weakest hand. They had the weakest hand in Palestine, And obviously we know that they had the weakest hand in Europe. In fact, they had no hand at all. And the whole world turned their back on us. The whole world. It was the doors shut in our faces. And we know the horrendous consequences of all of it. So I'm going to leave it here. I know how hard this is to be with. As you can feel, it's really hard for me. And like me, you might feel sadness, you might feel maybe anger, you might feel disbelief. This is tough, this is hard. And I'm just an email away. Just send me some notes, something. If you need clarification, if you have a question, I'm always happy to engage, to respond. I'm not going to get to the questions tonight. I think we stretched that as far as we could. But yeah, I'm sit with it for a little bit. Let it percolate. Read the material when it comes through your inbox tomorrow. And if you need to talk to me, email me. It's okay. Let's close tonight with a shalom chant. We entered with energies of peace, and we leave as best we can with energies of peace and wholeness and harmony. And as we close our eyes and find our breath, we find that deep center again. And take a breath for shalom. Thank you all. Thank you for staying with me.
Donnie, thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome.
Shalom to you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Danny, Rabbi.
Thank you,
for
thank you,
this.
thank you for teaching us.
You're welcome.